Hi Village, it's time for another Rooted Online. We're still working through chapter 2 of 1 Peter, so we're going to go through verses 18 through 20 today. It reads like this: Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. And what we have here is just a continuation of societal structures that Peter is telling the Christians he's writing to be subject to. So previously, in the paragraph before this, we were told to be subject to the governing authorities. And now Peter moves to slaves or servants to be subject to their masters. He's going to continue after this into several other relationships in which submission and subjection are important. And so this time we see servants, the ESV says, or some of your translations may say bondservants or even slaves. And the idea here is, before we go any further, we have to understand that in Peter's time, the slave was much different than what we know in America from Anglo-American slavery in England and the colonies, the horrible chattel slavery of kidnapping Africans and bringing them across the Atlantic to the New World. Slavery in Paul's day and Peter's day was almost unrecognizable if we compare it to American slavery. So we have to see how they're different. Here's a few ways they're different. It wasn't race-based. So slavery and servanthood that he's talking about is not race-based at all. Education was encouraged for servants. In fact, many servants were better educated than their masters were. And you'll see why in a few minutes. Some slaves could even own property, which meant they could even own other slaves. So you'd have some kind of hierarchy. The majority of slaves in cities and urban areas could realistically expect to be free by the time they were 30. So there was an emancipation process that was much more available to servants and slaves in the Roman Empire. They held high status, high-ranking positions in government. So you could be owned by someone else, but you still were able to serve in various levels of government, which is incredible for us to think about. Slaves could be farmers, doctors, lawyers, nannies, construction workers, writers, accountants, agents, secretaries, and many other places of employment is what I'm getting at. So yes, they were owned, and we can talk about the morality of that another time, but I think the idea of all these different positions that they could hold really helps to translate this passage to employer-employee relationships. So it helps the application to not be so much of a stretch, but to actually be pretty close to what we experience today. As long as we remember there are some differences, I think these verses really give us some help into how we should both be bosses and managers and supervisors, as well as employees. So it's really helpful for us to see this. With that in mind, Peter tells the servants to be subject to their masters with all respect. And so the idea there is respect or even fear, the reverential fear of someone in authority. And that's the overriding concern, is that the servant respects the master, acts in such a way, speaks in such a way as to show respect to the master. But then Peter really challenges these Christians and says, not only to the good ones. It's not that hard to be respectful of a good master or a good boss. It is really tough to be respectful of a bad boss, of a bad master. But Peter wants to drill down on this subject, that's really what he's going after, is being respectful of bad bosses, bad masters. In verse 19, he said this is a gracious thing. There's various ways that the translations go here, but it's very closely related to grace and favor. When he puts this sentence together, he's saying that it is a good thing, it's a gracious thing, it's a favorable thing. It receives God's favor if you do this. And what's this? When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So endurance is the key here. Endurance, perseverance, continuing on, going through unjust suffering that they don't deserve, presumably from their masters and from their work situation. They're to endure it. And they're to endure it mindful of God. And so the idea here is to be conscious of God. So the question would be for us is, are we conscious of God outside of the four walls of the church building? Are we conscious of God outside of religious experiences or times? When we're out in the workplace, do we see God having us there for a purpose? Do we ask why we're here? How can I work for God first in this environment? How can I show my fellow workers, my employer, my supervisor, my manager, that I'm a Christian in the way that I work? How can I be a different kind of worker because I am a Christian? Because I'm mindful, I'm conscious of God even on the job. And verse 20 kind of wraps up this section. And he makes a logical argument. What credit is it if when you sin or are beaten for it, you endure? Like, if you get in trouble, rightly, you should suffer for that. And now the question here is beating happening? And that's another subject. But the idea is they're being disciplined for what they did wrong. Well, you deserve that. What Peter wants to go after is, if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. So again, it's this unjust suffering. It's the getting a consequence that you don't deserve, something you didn't do, and then enduring it. Not quitting, not lashing out or lashing back, which is our first instinct, but to endure. Because you're conscious of God, because you understand that God sees. That last phrase, in the sight of God, God is watching, God knows, God sees. And the way that you act when you're unjustly treated at your job, in your work situation, is really important to show that we actually do believe in the God that we say we believe. So I think the applications in this passage are fairly evident for us, is to be hard workers, respecting our bosses, and to endure and expect even unjust treatment. So can we be mindful of God in those circumstances? Let's go about our lives mindful, conscious of God's presence in all of the things that we go through, specifically here, the unjust suffering.